August 14, 2016. Just past 11 at night. The streets were quiet, most families asleep, but inside one home, everything was about to change forever. Upstairs, a little boy woke to smoke filling his room. His cries cut through the night, desperate, terrified, calling for someone who wasn't coming. The fire moved fast, crawling up the walls, trapping him inside. Downstairs, a young maid, exhausted from her long day, stopped when she smelled something burning. At first, she thought it was nothing. Then she heard the sound no parent ever wants to hear, a child screaming for help. She didn't think. She ran. The house wasn't hers, the child wasn't hers. But in that moment, she became the only person standing between life and death. And the choice she made would not only save him, it would change her entire life in ways no one could have imagined. The maid's name was Elena Ramirez. She was 29 years old, a single mother working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. That night, her shift was almost over. Her body begged her to rest, but the sound of that child's cry cut through every thought in her head. She dropped the cleaning rag still in her hands and ran upstairs. By the time she reached the hallway, thick smoke poured through the cracks of the boy's bedroom door. She covered her mouth with her sleeve, kicked the door open, and was hit with a wave of heat. Flames were already climbing the curtains, licking the walls. And there, in the corner, coughing, eyes wide with fear, was the little boy, barely 6 years old. Elena didn't hesitate. She wrapped him in a blanket, pulled him close to her chest, and shielded his face from the smoke. The room was caving in on them, timbers groaning, glass shattering. Every second mattered. She stumbled back into the hallway, heart racing, struggling to see through the haze. The boy clung to her, whispering one word over and over. "Daddy! Daddy!" The staircase below was already burning. Every step threatened to collapse. Elena held the boy tighter, pressed her forehead to his and whispered, "I've got you, Mijo. Hold on." Then, with everything she had left, she charged down those stairs. Behind them, the fire roared like it wanted to swallow them whole. But she didn't stop, not until she burst through the front door into the cool night air, coughing, shaking, the boy still alive in her arms. The boy's father, Daniel Whitmore, arrived minutes later. It was 10:47 p.m. when his car screeched to a halt in front of the house, the headlights cutting through smoke that still rose into the night sky. He ran, stumbling, his tie half loosened, his face pale with terror. Neighbors held him back, but then he saw Elena, kneeling on the grass, clutching his son against her chest, both of them covered in ash. The boy coughed once, then reached out toward his father. Daniel froze. His hands trembled as he pulled the child into his arms, tears streaming down his face, relief and disbelief crashing into him all at once. But his eyes kept darting back to Elena. This woman, in her plain uniform, her face smeared with soot, hair damp with sweat, had walked through fire for his child. He tried to speak, but words caught in his throat. The crowd around them whispered, some filming on their phones, others shaking their heads in shock. Fire trucks roared up the street, sirens wailing, but Daniel stood still, holding his son, staring at Elena as if seeing her for the very first time. She coughed hard, catching her breath, and for a moment, the world was quiet except for the crackle of what remained of the burning home. Daniel finally whispered, his voice breaking, You saved him." Elena didn't answer. She simply lowered her eyes, her arms still trembling from the weight of what she had just done. By the next morning, the story had already spread across the neighborhood. Some called Elena a hero, others simply stared when she walked by, as if they couldn't reconcile the quiet maid they knew with the woman who had carried a child out of a burning house. She went back to work that day, mopping floors in silence, her body sore, her arms bruised, her throat raw from smoke. She wanted to disappear into her routine, but fate had other plans. At 6:30 that evening, as the sun dipped low, a black sedan pulled up outside the small apartment complex where she lived. Neighbors peeked through blinds as a man in a dark suit stepped out. It was Daniel Whitmore. He wasn't dressed like the frantic father from the night before. Tonight, he carried himself like the wealthy businessman he was, but his eyes still carried the weight of what he had almost lost. He knocked softly on her door, and when she opened it, her hair still damp from a hurried shower, her uniform folded neatly on the chair behind her, she froze at the sight of him. "Elena," he said quietly, almost unsure of himself. She shifted on her feet, clutching the edge of the door. He cleared his throat, then added, "I owe you more than words. Please, come to dinner with us tomorrow. My son keeps asking for you." For a long moment, she didn't answer. She wasn't used to men in suits standing at her doorstep, let alone inviting her into their world. Her instinct was to decline, to stay invisible, but she saw the boy's face flash in her mind, his small hand reaching for her in the smoke. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "If that's what you want." Daniel exhaled, almost in relief, and handed her a simple white envelope with his card inside. The sedan drove away into the night, leaving Elena standing in the hallway, clutching that card like it was something far heavier than paper. The next evening, at precisely 7:05 p.m., Elena stood frozen at the base of a long stone driveway, her hands trembling against the strap of her worn leather purse. The Whitmore estate stretched before her like something pulled from another life. Towering columns, a sweeping staircase, glass windows glowing golden from chandeliers inside. She had never walked into a place like this, not even in passing. Every instinct told her she didn't belong, but Daniel's words from the night before kept echoing in her ears, and so she took a step forward. The butler opened the heavy oak doors with a quiet nod, and Elena found herself standing in a marble foyer. Her plain gray dress looked even plainer against the sparkle of crystal and polished floors. From down the hall came the sound of laughter, a boy's laughter, and it cut through her fear. Daniel appeared moments later, dressed not in a suit but in a simple button-down shirt, a man trying, perhaps, to bridge the distance between their two worlds. He smiled, but his eyes studied her carefully, as if he wanted to understand the woman who had risked everything for his son. They sat at the long dining table, its surface set with silver cutlery and polished glass. Elena lowered herself slowly into a chair at the far end, her back straight, her hands clasped, afraid to even touch the water glass. Daniel's son ran in, his small arms flinging around her without hesitation, his voice breaking the silence. "You came." Her eyes softened, her hand brushing through his hair as though she had known him her entire life. For the first time since the fire, she allowed herself to smile, though faint and guarded. Dinner began, but it wasn't the food on the table that unsettled her. It was the weight of every glance from the house staff, the quiet whispers she thought she heard as they moved in and out of the room. She was no longer invisible. For the first time, she was being seen, and she wasn't sure if that frightened her more than the flames she had walked through. On the morning of August 15, 2014, just 2 days after that uneasy dinner, Elena arrived early at the company where she worked nights cleaning floors and scrubbing desks. Her mop and bucket sat waiting in the corner, but something felt different as she stepped into the lobby. The receptionist lifted her head and, instead of the usual dismissive glance, offered a quiet nod. For the first time, Elena wasn't just the woman in the uniform. People now whispered her name. The story of the maid who had carried a child through fire had spread far beyond the neighborhood. It had reached the man at the very top. Later that afternoon, she was called upstairs. The elevator doors opened to a floor she had never seen before. Polished wood, framed art on the walls, the air smelling faintly of leather and cedar. Waiting for her inside a wide office stood Daniel Whitmore. His suit was pressed, but his expression was almost uncertain, as if this moment mattered to him as much as it did to her. He gestured for her to sit, not across the desk, but beside him on the couch. She hesitated, then slowly lowered herself down, her hands clasped tight against her knees. Daniel leaned forward, his voice steady but carrying a weight of sincerity. He told her he had replayed that night over and over in his head, watching her carry his son out of the flames, risking her life with no thought of reward. He said no gift could ever repay that debt, but he wasn't offering charity, he was offering opportunity. He wanted her to step out from the shadows of night shifts and cleaning carts, to stand in a role that matched her courage. He spoke of giving her training, a position in his company, a chance to use her voice and her strength in a way the world had never allowed before. Elena's heart pounded as she listened. She was grateful, but the word seemed too large, too far from the life she had always known. Her first instinct was to refuse, to say she wasn't ready, wasn't worthy. She lowered her eyes, whispering that she had no education, no experience, nothing to offer. But Daniel shook his head, telling her that bravery, loyalty, and heart were worth more than degrees or titles. His son's life was proof of that. Then he placed a folder on the table between them, a formal offer, signed, waiting for her acceptance. The silence in that room stretched long, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. Elena stared at the papers, the letters blurring through tears that filled her eyes. For the first time in her life, a door wasn't just open, it was wide, and it was hers to walk through. On September 1, 2014, just weeks after the fire, Elena stepped into the same company she once cleaned, but this time, she wasn't carrying a mop or a bucket. She wore a tailored suit in a soft shade of gray, her hair neatly pulled back, her shoulders squared with a quiet strength. The employees who used to pass her without notice now turned their heads as she walked through the glass doors. Some whispered in surprise, others nodded with respect. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was the woman whose courage had shaken the walls of this building and changed its story forever. Daniel Whitmore stood by the boardroom entrance, watching her with a small smile. His son, still recovering but safe, had drawn a crayon picture of Elena holding his hand in front of a house with no flames. He had given it to her that morning. She carried that folded paper in her purse as a reminder of why this moment mattered. When she entered the boardroom, the directors who once would never have learned her name rose to greet her. Daniel introduced her not as a guest, not as a charity case, but as the company's new community liaison, a role built to give her voice, her story, and her heart a platform that could inspire others. The room filled with polite applause, but beneath it there was something stronger, a recognition that courage had been seated at the table. For Elena, it wasn't about titles or paychecks. It was about dignity. It was about proving to her children at home that their mother was more than the world had told her she could be. That night, as she walked out of the building beneath the fading summer sky, she paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the windows she used to clean. She remembered the long nights, the aching hands, the quiet prayers for a better life. Now, those prayers had found an answer. Not in luck, but in one act of selfless courage that had rewritten her future. From that day forward, Elena Vega was no longer just the maid who saved a child. She was a leader, a symbol of hope, and living proof that sometimes, the bravest moments are born in silence, when no one is watching.